Dan Henderson is a fucking Chad. When I think Dan Henderson, I think 67 Mustang, eating raw meat while slowly petting your AR-15 over an open fire. The dude has a jawline that would make marble sculptors of ancient Greece get a hard on, and it's fitting because Henderson is a very decorated wrestler in the Greco-Roman style. The guy has more medals than a North Korean general. He qualified for the NCAA championship, took part in the Summer Olympics, was national champ multiple times, and even got gold at the Pan American Championship. His wrestling skills would come in handy when he transitioned to MMA in '97. At the Brazil Open, his first MMA tournament, he faced Crezio de Souza and Eric Smith in the same night. De Souza, who today is a 7th degree coral belt, meaning he's been an active black belt for 30 fucking years, was Henderson's first ever fight in the cage. Henderson dominated the fight for the most part, avoiding submissions. De Souza, who was a scrappy fighter, tried his best to either get a KO or a submission, but with no luck. At some point, Hendo got top position and threw a few bombs, and the ref stepped in. Later that night, he also made short work of Mr. Smith, submitting him with a guillotine early in the fight. At UFC 17, Henderson would again have 2 fights in one night against Alan Goes and Carlos Newton, respectively. In his fight with Goes, Hendo got dropped and illegally kicked in the face, but he managed to recover quickly and get off some dirty boxing, walking away with a decision win. The fight with Newton was a fucking classic. Back then, Hendo's striking hadn't fully developed, and the H-bomb wasn't armed and ready yet. Newton came out fast and aggressive with good punches and kicks, but Hendo survived and took him down, getting off some ground and pound. It was a back and forth, with Henderson winning via split decision. Next, he went over to Japan to take part in King of Kings with our friends at Fighting Network Rings. It was a 32-man tournament with no weight limit, so sorta like a barbecue at Daniel Cormier's house. I'm joking, he's a great guy, but seriously, Dana, make an open weight division. I wanna see Ngannou versus Volkanovski. In the opening rounds, Hendo beat a Georgian guy with a well-placed knee to the ribs, as well as Hiromitsu Kanehara, in a very entertaining stand-up fight. Both guys came out swinging. Henderson's striking had gotten noticeably better. They both had some good moments, but ultimately, Henderson came out of it with a decision win. In the finals, Henderson had to fight Gilbert Yvel, Big Nog, and Renato Sobral in the same night. I don't know about you guys, but I'd rather shove a piece of durian fruit up my fucking ass than fight all of these dudes in the same night. Up until now, Hendo hadn't relied on his wrestling all that much, but with Yvel, who was bigger and a better striker, he showed a high fight IQ and took him down at will, punishing him at every opportunity. Yvel did what Yvel does and threw in some illegal strikes as well as some good kicks. Because Yvel was so big, Henderson was having a hard time holding him down, with Yvel just using brute strength to reverse position. With Big Nog, the two kind of just nullified each other. The majority of the fight was spent on the ground with Nogueira on top and Henderson avoiding submissions and scrambling for position. The Babalu fight wasn't that great. There weren't really any significant moments. There were some takedowns, a bit of striking, but nothing really memorable. Henderson won all 3 fights via decision, winning his 3rd tournament in a row. Out of Hendo's first 9 fights, 6 were won via decision, and to be honest, at least 2 of those were questionable, like the Nogueira win. I'm not ragging on Henderson, he fought well. All I'm saying is he got lucky with the judges there. Henderson was now ready for the big show. It didn't take long for the boys over at Pride FC to snatch Henderson up and offer him a spot with the promotion. And just like with Fedor, they had some mean motherfuckers waiting to say hello. You know those movies where the hero has to fight the main villain at the very beginning, just so we can all see how painfully inadequate he is? Hendo's Pride career kind of started like that, with his first opponent being Vanderlei Silva. Granted, Silva hadn't won the middleweight belt yet, but he was just 1 or 2 fights away. It would be a long night for Hendo because Silva's striking was more advanced and he also had great takedown defense. What was worse, even though Hendo cracked Silva a few times and there was a golf ball growing out of his left eye, Vanderlei was in his happy place. He was smiling like the village idiot because he was getting paid to stomp on this guy's head. He dropped Hendo a few times and stuffed most of the takedowns, basically just manhandling Henderson every chance he got. Of course, Dan has always been a tough bastard, so Silva had to settle for a decision victory. One thing I loved about Pride was how yoked everyone was. It was like Muscle Beach out there. You didn't see a guy for a few months and then he came out looking like Ronnie Coleman. Pride didn't give a fuck about steroids. As far as they were concerned, that shit was kawaii. Hendo's first legit KO came against Renzo Gracie. In a very short fight, Hendo landed a right uppercut and sent Renzo packing to the Shadow Realm. Hendo would be the first guy to knock out a Gracie. He had 2 more fights against Akira Shoji and Shogun's brother, Murillo Hua or Ninja. In his fight with Ninja, Hendo spent most of the time on his back, with Ninja not really doing much, but in round 3 he landed some decent shots and scored a few takedowns. The judges over at Pride would call the fights differently than in the West. The rounds didn't matter as much, it was the fight as a whole, so even though Ninja was in what we might call the dominant position for the majority of the fight, it didn't really count for much because there wasn't a lot of offense. In any case, Hendo got the decision win. Hendo's first ever fight was against a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and he would fight many black belts through his career, and no doubt due to his high-level wrestling background, he rarely got submitted. His next fight was against another black belt, Ricardo Arona. Arona dominated the fight, which was mostly a grappling match. He got off some ground and pound and was looking for the submission, but Dan was just so tough to put away that Arona would also have to settle for a decision victory. Big Nog came back around in a rematch, the 3rd black belt Hendo fought since he got to Pride. This fight was pretty much a repeat of their first match, with Nogueira on top trying everything and anything to submit Hendo. Dan managed to escape a crazy omoplata sweep and did his best to scramble for position, but Nogueira would just transition from one submission to the next, catching Hendo with a slick armbar. Dan would make a searing comeback like a bad case of herpes and win his next 4 fights.
I think age been good here.
And to not be taken down, and now he's just landing combinations.
For the top middleweight fighters in the world.
Looking good.
Now the full mount, and Henderson with that devastating right hand, known for his power here, and Kon Know trying to win.
Yes, sir. Very
Nicely done, and the uppercut in the left hand.
But you know what?
Oh, nice. That's the Henderson we're used to seeing.
Nice.
Until getting matched up with Little Nog, this time in the 2003 Middleweight Grand Prix. Both guys had some moments. Hendo went for a few takedowns and was swinging for the fences. After it went to the ground, Nogueira did his little omoplata sweep from his back, just like his brother. And after ending up on top, he went for a kimura, but transitioned into an armbar, which can only be described as a beautiful sequence. Now Hendo had lost to both Nogueira brothers via armbar. Dan would move down to welterweight after his loss and join the Pride 2005 Welterweight Grand Prix. In the opening round, Dan would deliver the H-bomb to both Ryo Chonan and Akihiro Gono. He would then face Murilo Bustamante again for all the marbles at Pride Shockwave 2005. Bustamante did well in the first round with decent striking. When it went to the ground, Bustamante was mostly on top, getting off some ground and pound. In round 2, Hendo used his wrestling to secure some takedowns and did drop Bustamante once or twice, winning via split decision. By defeating Bustamante, Dan had won the Pride FC Welterweight Championship. as well as the Pride Welterweight Grand Prix. He would have 2 more fights in the welterweight division in Pride. A back-to-back affair with Kazuo Misaki, winning his first fight by decision and then losing the other by decision. Hendo moved up to light heavyweight to fight Vitor Belfort at Pride 32. Dan out-wrestled Vitor, not allowing him to get his striking going, and won via decision. It was now time to face the main boss again, at Pride 33. The two would fight for the middleweight belt, but this time, Henderson had evolved to his knock you the fuck out form. Of course, the axe murderer had been on an absolute rampage, so this was never going to be an easy fight. The fight was everything that was promised and more. Both guys were in the pocket, swinging heavy. In round 2, Hendo was the one that got a takedown and spent the whole round tenderizing Silva. In the third and final round, Silva did what he always does and just said, fuck it. After a few wild exchanges, Hendo stunned Silva with a right and then turned his lights out with a left hook. It was fucking beautiful. Dan had now come full circle in Pride, being the first fighter to win belts in multiple weight classes, as well as being the first fighter to hold 2 belts at the same time in Pride FC. When the UFC acquired Pride, they also got many fighters from their roster as well. Hendo, being the fucking badass that he was, wasn't about to get passed over. Now was a chance to see how the elite Pride FC fighters would measure up. For you new people, in the 2000s, the UFC and Pride FC, 2 of the biggest MMA promotions at the time, were locked in a dick measuring contest that made John Holmes and Ron Jeremy look like a bunch of fucking eunuchs. So Hendo would have to have 2 back-to-back title fights to unify the Pride belts. And because Pride had different weight limits for their divisions, Hendo would be fighting for the UFC light heavyweight belt as well as the UFC middleweight belt. His first opponent would be Rampage for the light heavyweight title. Rampage got the light heavyweight belt when he knocked out Chuck Liddell some months prior. The fight was very evenly matched. Both guys landed good shots, both guys got takedowns, but Rampage just had a slight edge. He managed to get the better positions in the wrestling engagements and delivered some good ground and pound that earned him the decision win. In his fight with the Spider, Hendo started off strong and took Silva down, doing some damage. But in the second, after a wild exchange, Silva cracked Hendo and forced him to shoot in for a takedown. But Silva ended up on top and took Hendo's back. With only a few seconds left, the Spider managed to lock up a fulcrum choke and won the fight. Hendo failed to unify the belts, but he was by no means out. He got back in the win column when he beat MMA sweetheart Husimar Palhares and roughed up the violent math teacher Rich Franklin. His win over Franklin earned him a spot on The Ultimate Fighter as a coach with his new bestie Michael Bisping. During the course of the show, the boys went together about as well as drinking and driving or Brendan Schaub and stand-up comedy. Michael Bisping always had some snide remark while Hendo barely talked. They got into it a few times. You guys know how this shit goes by now. They finally got to kiss and make up at UFC 100. Hendo came out very aggressive with the H-bomb, armed and ready. Bisping was a bit more technical. He had good footwork, trying to stick and move. For some reason, later in the fight, Bisping started to circle in the direction of Hendo's right, exactly what his coaches had told him not to do in between rounds. Hendo's right hand always had good range. He came in with a leg kick and just torpedoed that right hand into Bisping's chin, hitting him right on the button. Bisping fell over like a brick wall and Dan followed up with his infamous dive bomb punch. And even though Hendo faced criticism for that, he later said that it did feel good though. That was the first time Michael Bisping had been knocked out. Dan got $100K for that punch as well as Fight of the Night and year honors. Even though his fight with the Count was a title eliminator, Hendo left the UFC and signed with Strikeforce for some reason. There, he immediately got a shot at the Strikeforce middleweight belt against Jake Shields. The fight went all 5. In round 1, Hendo dropped Shields twice and had him badly hurt, but Shields somehow survived. In the rounds after that, Shields just went for takedown after takedown, with Hendo unable to defend. Shields spent most of the fight on top in mount, winning via decision. Next up was Renato Sobral again. Hendo made short work of Babalu this time, TKOing him early on in the fight. He He would then get another shot at Strikeforce gold, this time at light heavyweight against Rafael Cavalcante, better known as FredJack. In round 1, Hendo got rocked bad and dropped, but secured a takedown and recovered. After some back and forth, Hendo found the mark with his right and just swarmed FredJack, adding yet another belt to his collection. Dan's send-off fight from Strikeforce would be against legend Fedor Emelianenko. Fedor came out aggressive and both men were throwing heavy. In another sequence, Fedor came in with punches and hit the mark with a left uppercut and dropped Hendo. Fedor jumped on top, but Dan's wrestling kicked in and he managed to sneak out from underneath Fedor and landed a disgusting uppercut underneath the armpit and into the chin of Fedor, following up with punches. To me, this is one of my favorite fights with Hendo. It just showcases his best attributes in a very short fight. Power, durability, and tremendous wrestling. I'll say it again, Dan Henderson was a tough SOB. You could never really count him out, even at age 40. Dan never defended his light heavyweight belt in Strikeforce, even though he had expressed a desire to do so. When Dan came around for his final run in the UFC at age 41, he would not disappoint. He wasn't just going to slink off into the night, not Dan fucking Henderson. He still had a few scalps to take. His first fight back was against Shogun, and it was an absolute dogfight, a war of attrition. This fight had everything. Takedowns, guys getting dropped left and right. In round 1 and 2, Hendo was just being a bully, beating Shogun up. Of course, Shogun never was a pushover and he fired back as best he could. In round 3, both guys landed good shots. Shogun came in hot with a flurry trying to put Dan away, but ended up getting cracked himself. In round 4, both guys got takedowns and Hendo got hit with a disgusting uppercut Shogun had been trying to land all night. Hendo pulled through and hit Shogun flush with his right. The fight was amazing. If you haven't seen it, go watch it right now. The boys earned Fight of the Night honors, and rightfully so. Shogun had his little white Speedos on, and by the end of the fight, they were completely red. Hendo did lose his next 2 against Machida and Rashad. The fight with Machida was as expected. Machida was elusive, throwing a lot of kicks and feints, and won by points. The Rashad fight was similar in the sense that there weren't really any significant moments, but Rashad did a bit more to earn himself the decision win. Hendo's granite chin finally got cracked at age 43, and it only took someone like TRT Vitor to do it. We call him TRT Vitor, but we should have been calling him Feral Vitor during that time period. The dude was fucking terrifying. I'm actually surprised they didn't wheel him out like Hannibal Lecter in a straitjacket wearing a muzzle. This was at the end of Vitor's head kicking spree. He hit Dan with a left hook, knocking him down, and when he popped back up, Belfort kicked him in the head. Through his career, Hendo always had that tendency to dip his head to one side, leaving him open for that left high kick. Of course, Vitor thanked God for the win and not the cycle he was on. Yeah, Hendo was on TRT too, but he wasn't 36 anymore, so the rematch with Shogun was also a great fight, just not as long as the first one. Both guys were throwing heavy. Dan stunned Shogun with a punch, but Shogun came right back and rocked Hendo. The fight went to the ground and Shogun got on top, throwing nasty shots. In round 2, Hendo was put down by that uppercut and spent the rest of the round on his back. And in round 3, Hendo finished the fight with what, in my opinion, is one of the smoothest transitions I've seen in a finish. It started with Dan going for a double leg, but Shogun stuffed it, so Hendo changed levels and goes back up into a kind of body lock, sidesteps and uses the momentum to swing Shogun into his right hand. It was a thing of beauty. It was decades of experience in 2 or 3 fluid motions. That fight also won Fight of the Night. Hendo would lose his next 2 against Daniel Cormier and Gegard Mousasi. DC ragdolled a much smaller Hendo the whole fight, getting the rear naked, and Mousasi won by TKO in a short fight that some people claim had a controversial stoppage. Next, Dan knocked out Tim Boetsch with ease and then had his trilogy fight with Belfort. Vitor managed to land another head kick here and just swarmed Hendo, getting the win. Hendo's final victory in the cage was against Hector Lombard. Both guys came out swinging, with Lombard getting the better of it, but Hendo survived through sheer toughness. And in round 2, Hendo landed a head kick of his own. Lombard kind of grabbed his leg and Dan threw a back elbow straight to the dome of Lombard, knocking him out. It was the first time Lombard was knocked out. Dan Henderson's last fight in the UFC was a title fight and for the middleweight belt against Michael Bisping. The count got dropped twice, but he did recover and got some strikes in, winning via decision, something you definitely could not tell by looking at his face. After the Bisping fight, Dan retired from the sport at age 46. So what more is there to say? If you've been watching up until this point, you already know this guy's track record. Olympic level wrestler, first fighter in Pride FC to win championship belts in multiple weight divisions, as well as being champion in multiple divisions simultaneously. Strikeforce heavyweight champion, oldest fighter in the UFC to fight for a belt, UFC Hall of Famer, knockout of the year winner, the list goes on. Plus, the guy's like 52 now and has a wife that's probably half his age. I'd say all of that is deserving of Alpha Chief status. And when Henderson retired at age 46, yeah, he lost a few fights, he got knocked out once or twice, but against top-level competition. In fact, if you look at Dan's record, he was always fighting the best. His MMA record reads like a who's who of mixed martial arts. It's not like he lost to a bunch of bums and then decided to retire. Guys were still having a hard time putting him away. Dude was tough as fucking nails. Still had power, still was dangerous. Dan Henderson is part of that elite old guard that built this fucking thing. Hendo's the fucking man. Enough said. If you made it this far, please consider liking, subscribing, or at least commenting. If not, whatever. We can still be friends.